to Iran now, where the deadly toll of widespread protests and government crackdown is becoming clearer. The US-based group human rights activists working in Iran say it has verified the deaths of over 3,000 people during the first 20 days of nationwide demonstrations against the regime. Over 2,000 more have been seriously injured and more than 10 times that amount have been arrested. The cleric-run regime's heavy deployment of security forces appears to have quelled the demonstrations in recent days. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, accused US President Donald Trump of inflicting casualties on the Iranian people during the protests. Meanwhile, a huge number of families are now struggling to come to terms with the sudden and brutal death of their loved ones. Next, we meet the relatives of one such victim from Tehran.
Robina Aminyan was a fashion student in Tehran. Her family say security forces shot her in the back of the head at close range. Thousands of kilometers away, her aunt Hali, who lives in Norway, scrolls through photos and videos of Robina.
She knew that doing nothing would never bring the future she dreamed of. So she acted. She was practical and determined to gain her freedom. She went out unarmed, carrying only her voice and her body to call for freedom. And she was killed on her way toward freedom and a better life.
Unrest in Iran started at the end of December as protests against economic hardship. As authorities cracked down, the movement swelled into widespread anti-government demonstrations. Rights groups say security forces have killed thousands of protesters. The government, in turn, says hundreds were killed because armed rioters hijacked the protests. These videos of a morgue in Tehran were posted on social media this week. There have been reports of family members searching for lost loved ones. Despite a nationwide blackout, Robina's aunt and uncle tried to find out what happened to their niece.
What they describe, my family, is that there were hundreds, maybe thousands of bodies piled on top of each other. My sister was searching for Robina's face. She looked through so many beautiful faces, trying to find her girl. And what is so horrifying for me is imagining what my sister felt as she searched for her daughter. Hundreds and hundreds of bodies.
With no funeral possible and little contact with their family in Iran, they mourn Robina alone.
And joining me now is Simon Mabon, a Middle East analyst at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Simon, thanks for joining us. Well, stories from families desperately trying to find their relatives, like the one we've just seen in this report, are hard to stomach, but they help us understand the scale of the human cost of this crackdown. What do we do with that knowledge, with understanding the scale?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because these are very, very common stories. These are stories from people who do not know what has happened to their loved ones in many cases, who have not been able to get in touch with families and friends back in Iran on a general scale, who do not know what, if anything, has happened to their families. I've spoken to colleagues and friends who found out just by chance that their family members had been arrested as part of this wider crackdown. And that produces so much anger, so much anxiety, so much concern. And I guess on a personal level, all we can do is be there to listen to and support people who have endured this and will continue to endure this, because sadly, I don't think this is over by any way, shape or form.
So, from your perspective, I mean, how is the Iranian government spinning this recent protest and certainly the harsh response that followed? And are they successful in doing so?
Well, we've seen Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on X saying that this is the fault of Donald Trump, telling people to go on to the streets and protest. We've seen other prominent Iranian officials saying that this is a direct consequence of foreign unrest and external actors trying to manipulate what is happening. And this, of course, taps into long-standing narratives from Iranian history about American meddling, about British meddling, about Russian meddling, about Israeli meddling. Take your pick. There are lots of different examples from across history of foreign actors getting involved, trying to manipulate Iranian politics. And that's what they're clearly trying to tap into here. Whether it's landing or not, I'm not entirely convinced. I think there is a lot of anger on the streets of Tehran and across Iran more broadly. There's certainly lots of anger across the world at the brutal repression of a pro-democracy protest. So I think it's landing amongst certain constituencies, i.e. those that are already favorable to such narratives, but amongst others, they are just hearing it for what it is, as hollow words and an attempt to divert the blame away from the regime.
So for the time being, would you say the regime survived this episode?
It looks like it for now, but the latent anger, the latent causes of this unrest, the socioeconomic pressures, the rising prices, food prices rose 70%, for example, the continued crackdown on any form of dissent, the repression and closure of the internet, and indeed the legacy of the brutal killing of thousands. We don't know how many, but some estimates have put it around 20,000 people being killed in this series of protests. That will remain. That will not just go away, and that generates more and more anger. So there will be another round of protests, I'm sure of that. And for now, it's survived, but it has not in any way, shape or form addressed the deep underlying factors that led to the protests in the first place. In fact, they've only made them worse.
So, Simon, the anger remains, perhaps is even growing. So this is certainly not the last protest that we've seen. But what could tip the scales to really topple the Iranian government? And could it happen from within Iran, or would it need to have outside, I don't know, support? I mean, what are we looking at?
I think if we look at other examples from across the Middle East in recent years, when there has been a fall of what is essentially an authoritarian regime, it has required, necessarily required, the defection of key regime military officials. It's required people in the armed forces, other prominent government officials to say, no, enough is enough. We are not standing by this. It happened in Syria in 2011 with the Arab uprisings. It happened later on, of course, when Assad eventually fell. It happened in Egypt. It's happened in lots of different cases where we see authoritarian leaders falling. As of now, though, it has not happened in Iran. And so until we start to see the cracks within the regime, i.e. members of the Revolutionary Guard Force deserting Khamenei or other prominent officials deserting the supreme leader, then I think the regime will be able to deal with domestic unrest. But then the question is, what happens if external actors get involved? What happens if the US decide to bomb?
Right.
Will that, as some have led to believe, lead to a rally around the flag effect, or will it actually just culminate in the fall of the Iranian state? So we just don't know. There's too many unknowns right now, I think.
All right. Middle East analyst Simon Mabon at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Thank you so very much for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Well, Sara Kermanian is a researcher in international relations at the University of Sussex. She joins us from Brighton in the UK. Great to see you. Good to have you with us. We're hearing painful stories of families searching morgues for missing loved ones. What do these stories tell us about the scale and the impact of the crackdown?
Thank you for having me. I think the stories where we hear these days, although admittedly they cannot be fact-checked, yes, but prove that the speculated high number of death tolls that we had earlier is most likely correct. They prove high levels of unacknowledged death, enforced disappearances, and a more systemically enforced terrorization of people by taking very brutal measures in killing people, showing it to the public, putting it into display, by dehumanizing the dead, by torturing families. So this pattern indicates, I think, a strategy aimed at both physical repression and psychological terror, through which the state tries to prevent future uprisings through instituting a public trauma.
These protests began over economic hardship but grew into much more, even if they have now been suppressed. How are Iranians feeling toward their government, especially after the killings of so many of its citizens?
Well, indeed, the protest initially erupted over economic hardship, and this is what I talked about earlier when I was at Deutsche Welle. But their spread towards marginal cities and other social groups turned them into a display for people showing their demand for the removal of the state. And we were expecting the state's response to become more and more violent as the protests were spreading through like other spaces and other cities. What we hear these days from indeed limited channels, but still, they show that people feel like they have entered a no-return way, that they are terrorized in a way, but also have no doubt that, for instance, a reform or their life cannot redeem this state, and has a state that has so brutally killed its own civilians cannot be redeemed through like a reformation route. It is fair to say then that even to Islamic Republic, even though Islamic Republic has lost its hegemony at the moment, had lost its hegemony actually before the unrest, but no, its legitimacy is even more widely questioned, and I think the state is now in a question that it cannot really maintain its dominance other than through militaristic means. So ideology doesn't really work anymore, and this means that, well, it has lost its hegemony to its people, its legitimacy to its people completely, and people really want it gone.
Yeah. As to how the Iranian government is spinning the recent protests and the harsh response that followed, how successfully are they doing it? Who's still listening?
I think the official narratives, because, well, they have been able to, we hear in some narratives that they have been able to take control of, for instance, urban spaces, even though we also hear that people's resistances continue. But what is more important in the way they are kind of, they're spinning the recent protests is that the official narratives advance by the Islamic Republic frame the protests as externally orchestrated unrest, driven by foreign enemies, intervention, separatists or terrorists groups. They are not even accepting responsibility for killing killing civilians. They say that it was the responsibility of these other groups rather than as expression of domestic discontent. So violence by security forces is justified as a necessary response to chaos, while deaths are either denied, minimized, people are dehumanized, etc. But none of this was really unexpected. But what is very painful these days is that lots of Western media, we also see that they are giving presence to these voices from inside the government of Iran. And what is unfortunate is that even Donald Trump, for instance, despite, very ironically, him being one of the persons Islamic Republic identifies as an external source of conspiracy, but we hear some of these narratives through which the state tries to justify its violence from his words. For instance, he says that well, he was denying that the Iranian state is actually committing they're conducting these brutal measures for a long while, and was repeating that if they kill people, even though they've killed thousands of people, and they've confessed it today. Also, like even very recently, he was showing happiness, and he thanked the leaders of Iran for not executing 80 people. So I think this is really sad that they are trying to use this narrative to justify their actions, and that we hear it in Western media. We hear many Western leaders also using, also giving like channeling these narratives and giving presence to them.
Sara Kermanian at the University of Sussex in Brighton. We'll leave it there, and thank you so much. To talk more about this, I'm joined by historian and Iran expert, Professor Ali Ansari from the School of History at the University of St Andrews. Great to see you. We heard the numbers, you heard them too. According to human rights organisations, more than 3,000 people killed. How does this crackdown then fit in the context of the history of violence against citizens in Iran?
Well, let's assume that the figures that we have at the moment are probably an underestimate. So I think in looking at it historically, This is probably the greatest single slaughter of Iranian citizens by their government in about 150 years. I mean, I think there have been, more widespread levels of brutality, but it's been over a more prolonged period of time. So certainly after the revolution, there was a great amount of bloodletting after the fall of the Shah, but that would have taken over, a period of, say, 18 months as the revolution sorted itself out, so to speak. This, conducted over about 3 days of a crackdown, a very particularly brutal crackdown, is unprecedented.
Iran's supreme leader blamed thousands of deaths on Israel and the US while the protests were going on, specifically accusing Donald Trump of complicity. How many people in Iran still see the US and Israel as a bigger obstacle to a better standard of living than the Iranian regime itself at this point?
I think the people who believe this sort of stuff are very much in a minority now in Iran. It's quite clear that what the brutality has actually done is it's made people extremely angry, extremely frustrated. And for the first time, you're really hearing a lot of people in Iran calling for foreign intervention, which is extremely unusual, I have to say, in Iranian political history. Most people would say, do not, get involved. But I think people are getting extremely desperate now. This is not over by a long shot. I mean, I think we look at it now and we say that they've suppressed it for the time being, but at what cost? And it's quite clear as the internet shutdown continues that they have not managed to suppress it all yet, and they certainly haven't been able to sort of clean up the mess they've created. But the level of brutality has ensured that I think the level of anger in wider society, and certainly any sort of sense of social contract between state and society, has been broken.
It's fascinating, Ali. How then are, against that backdrop, how then are the clerics still holding on to power beyond the muscle of the security forces and the threat of jail and execution? How is it that they're still holding on to power?
Difficult. It's very difficult to say. I mean, at the end of the day, these protests, and many Iranians are calling them an uprising, by the way, rather than a protest, then I think that's probably a better descriptor. But these protests are on the back of, really, they're symptomatic of the wider economic malaise. And the economic malaise is extremely serious. So this sort of clampdown, the crackdown, the shutting down of the internet, the inability of businesses to work, it can't be helping. It won't help the economic crisis, and actually will accelerate that economic crisis. So they're very much in a very difficult situation, but a difficult situation of their own making.
So just to underline before we go, the protests have subsided a little for now. What is your take then? Does this mean the regime has survived this episode?
I think it survived this episode, but I don't think this episode necessarily is finished yet. And I think there will be a return to more protests in the not too distant future. Even if that were not to happen, the regime will face enormous economic difficulties going forward. And we are, I don't see how they can sustain the current situation at all. So there are difficult times ahead. People will have to digest, particularly in Iran, what has happened. There'll be more information coming out, obviously, over the next few weeks. But just as in the aftermath of the Iran-Israel war back in June, the consequences will be long in gestation, and we will see them in due course.
Historian and Iran expert Ali Ansari, great to get your input. Thanks so much.
Thank you.